In this video, I'm going to be showing you how you can create a GraphQL API using TypeScript. So we're going to be interacting with a database and building an example where we go over CRUD operations, how to create, read, update, and delete stuff. Now, there's several different ways you can build a GraphQL server with TypeScript. I'm going to be showing you my favorite way and the way that I build it for my own personal projects. So let's go ahead and just jump right into things. So here I have a project already kind of set up, at least some boilerplate set up. And the way I did this was by running the following command: npx create GraphQL API, and then the name of my project. Now, you may not have heard of this because I literally just created it. And so this is a CLI that will initialize you with a GraphQL server to help you get started a little bit easier. So I kind of want to just show you the things that this comes with when you run this command. So I thought we'd start in the package.json and just talk about a few packages that I have installed for this. The idea of this is it's going to configure a server with a database in TypeScript so you can just get up and running quicker. All right, and this is basically what I configure every time that I want to start a new project anyway with this stack, so I figured I'd make something simpler for myself. All right, so first off, we're using Apollo. You'll notice we're using, for the actual server itself, Express. So Apollo Server Express package is a middleware that we're going to stick on Express, and it's going to run the GraphQL route. We're using GraphQL, so we need to install the GraphQL package. Now, we are using TypeORM as our interface or ORM to the database, and TypeORM uses this library called reflect metadata. We're also using this library called TypeGraphQL. So this is an integration that makes it very easy to write GraphQL and TypeScript things that mesh really nice together. And we're going to see why it's nice in a second. And this also needs reflect metadata. And then lastly, I chose to use the SQLite database for this. Reason being is it's really easy to set up, so you don't even need to install a database. And it has a very compatible API with other SQL databases. So after you run this command, you just cd into the folder, and then you run yarn start, and it's going to start up a server for you, and we can do database stuff just like that. You don't need to install anything else or configure a user, because there has been some friction with people installing that, setting up a database server. Now, normally I would recommend using Postgres. That's what I tend to use, but this is a great option for dev, and you can easily swap everything out. They are compatible for mostly everything. Actually, before we leave this, one last thing I want to note about this is I'm using no daemon to start up the server. So this is going to exec flag here. It's going to run this command. So it's going to run tsnode, which just runs the TypeScript Node.js project for us. And so what no daemon does, it's going to watch our project and our files. So if I make a change and save it, it's going to restart for us. So it's pretty handy. So there is an ormconfig.json file. This just tells TypeORM what we're actually using. This is like the settings for it. The main thing is we told it we're using a SQLite database, and here's the name of the database. So when you actually run the server with npm start or yarn start, it's going to generate a database.sqlite file, and that's where our database is going to sit. And so personally, how I plan to use this is to just use SQLite, and then if you have Postgres installed, you can swap it out, or when I get to a point where I'm ready to swap it out, I can, and most of the commands should be compatible. All right, and then here is the index.ts. So this is the start. And so here we have a function that is asynchronous that calls itself. So that's what the syntax is. So here you can see this is a function. It's wrapped in a parenthesis, and then it's just calling itself. So this is just a standard way you will see people start in their index.ts files. And so this is a function that just calls itself, and that way we can have async and we can await things. So here I'm creating an Express instance. I am creating a database connection. Create connections coming from TypeORM. I'm initializing an Apollo server instance. You'll notice I am creating the GraphQL schema with this build schema function, which is coming from TypeGraphQL. And then I have a single resolver, a hello world resolver, which we'll look at in a second. And then I'm just getting the context where I get the request and the response, and I stick it here. And so this is a GraphQL context. We'll see more about this later as well. And then we just apply the middleware. So this is just how Apollo server works when you're setting it up. This is how we get it to connect with our Express instance. And then lastly, I'm just starting the server here, app.listen. And then the only other thing to show you guys is the Hello World resolver. So this is a very simple type GraphQL example. So this is a GraphQL schema that's being generated from this. So we can see I have a single query. This query returns a string. The name of the query is hello, and this is what the actual resolver function returns, which is just a string that says hi. And then I have an entity file. This has a user. This is mapped to TypeORM. This is just an example entity. So this will actually create a user table. So these will map to columns. And then this is kind of like a user table. All right, so this is what it comes with. And this is basically the structure to get you started. So now we can actually start adding stuff. And in this video, we're going to do some CRUD operations. But before we do, just to verify that our server's up and running, this is what it looks like in the log for me. So Express server started, and I also have logging on so we can see any kind of SQLite commands that are getting run. All right, so if we start up that server and go to localhost 4000/GraphQL, we'll see the GraphQL playground right here. And here I can run hello, and we can see hi shows up here. So if you get this, that means you're all set up and you're working correctly. We can look at the docs if we want to. And so this is where we're going to start from. And so, yeah, that's the boilerplate CLI that's going to set this stuff up for you. And this is kind of the start of projects, usually for me anyway. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new entity here. So I'm going to create a movie entity. .ts. I'm going to start by saying export class movie, and I'm going to make this an entity, and we'll use the entity decorator here to say that, and this comes from TypeORM. I'm going to have a number field here, and I'm going to say generated. This is a primary generated column, and all that means is it's going to be 0, then 1, or it's going to probably start at 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and it's going to automatically pick the ID for me, and they're going to be unique and stuff. So we have an ID. I'm going to have a title, which is a string. So we're going to say here column, and by default TypeORM will infer the type based on the TypeScript type. So this is the TypeScript type here. We can explicitly set the type here. I actually don't know types for SQLite. If I was using Postgres, I'd make this a text column, but I'm not sure what you use for SQLite, so I'm just going to keep it like this and let TypeORM infer. And here I'm going to have, not age, I'm going to have length, which I'm going to have actually minutes. I'm going to call it minutes because I want to know how long a movie is. So this will be number. And then here, I'm going to make an int. I'm guessing they have an int type. I want to just show you guys that you can also pass in TypeORM options here of anything you want to set. So for example, I can set the default movie length to an hour like that. Oops, like that. We can also make things, for example, nullable to true if we want to allow this to be null. But I'm not. I'm just going to do this. All right, so I've made my first entity, so now I should have a movie table in my database, and I'm going to create a new resolver, movie resolver.ts, and we're going to say class movie resolver, and then I'm going to say resolver, and the first thing that I want to do is create a mutation. So I'm going to use the mutation decorator from Type GraphQL. And so mutations are usually what you use in GraphQL when you want to update or make a change on your server. In this case, we are going to create a movie, is what I'm going to call it. All right, so this is a function. I'm going to export my class. And before I go any further, I just want to import this in my index. And I'm going to pass it as a resolver that gets created here. All right, so in my create movie guy here, the first thing I can do is tell Type-GraphQL what the return value of the mutation is going to be. So by default, I'm going to just return a Boolean, true or false, whether it worked. And then we may change this and do different stuff later. So we're going to say true by default. And in my function right here, I can pass arguments in. So I can say arg. And this is something coming from Type-GraphQL. And so here I can give it a name. So for example, title, which is a string. And then I can say title here, and then I can say string here. Oops, and we don't need to put this here. So this is the full thing that you can write here, where I'm being explicit about everything. So this is the variable name that I want to use in this function. So I call it title. I said the TypeScript type is a string. And then you'll notice I also did this annotation here. And so this part is for Type-GraphQL and for the GraphQL schema. So I'm just going to do console.log title for now. So because I put this here, what this does is this is going to be the name of the argument in my GraphQL schema, and this is going to be the type in the GraphQL schema. And I can see my stuff is automatically, my server restarted for me. So I don't need to do anything. I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to look at the docs. And it's gonna be blocking. You can move it over. I'm kind of blocking this, but you can see right here that the create movie title returns a string. So you can see the argument here and the value it returns. And because of that, I can name this whatever I want here. So I could call this instead name. And so these can be different if they want to, or they can be the same. And just refresh. Oh, I think it automatically did it. That's pretty cool. We can see the name is here. So that's kind of the difference between why we do it here and why we do it here. Now this, I'm explicitly saying the type, but Type-GraphQL can actually infer that this is a string. So we can just leave it like that, and we don't have to explicitly declare the GraphQL type if it's the same. Now it can't always infer everything, so if this was possibly null, then I would have to say string, and then there's a third parameter here where I can say nullable is true. So this is how you can say a nullable argument. But okay, we're just gonna do this for now. Now I can also do a second argument, which I'm gonna call minutes, and it's gonna be a number. Now, you'll notice, if you're familiar with GraphQL, number is not a GraphQL type. It can either be an integer or it can be a float. So we have to explicitly say here which one it is. In my case, the minutes is going to be of the type integer, and int comes from Type-GraphQL. All right, so we have minutes and title. We can now create our user. Our movie. So here in my movie, I'm also going to say extends base entity. This will allow us to use the following syntax. I can say movie dot insert, and I can insert a movie. So I'm going to pass in a title and the number of minutes that the movie, the length of it, and I'm just going to insert that into the database. And I'm going to make this asynchronous here. And I'm going to just await the insert, and we're going to return true. All right, we're going to save this. We'll let our server restart. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create. All right, cool, it's done. Now I'm going to create, I'm going to say mutation. And we have create movie. Say title, it's going to be Bob the movie. And control space in this editor will bring up autocomplete. Minutes, this is a 30-minute film, and that's all I need to do. So we'll run this, and it created my movie. Now we can't really see any of the movie because I decided to just return a Boolean here. But we can create a query. This is usually what you do in GraphQL when you want to fetch stuff. And we can say async. Actually, I don't even think I need to make this async. We're going to say movies and just return them all. So what I'd like to do in this statement here is return all the movies. So I'm going to say movie.find and just return them all. Now I need to specify what the return type is of my query here. And one way of specifying this is you'll notice we're going to return an array of movies. So we need to actually create the GraphQL type for a movie. Now I could create a class up here called GraphQL movie type or something like that, and I could fill out the fields. But one of the cool integrations that you can do with TypeGraphQL and TypeORM is we can actually go to our entity over here, because this looks exactly like the class or the movie GraphQL type. And so I can annotate these with the field decorator from TypeGraphQL. So you notice I'm going to put it on all three of these. And again, this is something where it can infer the type sometimes. It cannot infer the number type. So I'm going to say this is going to be an int. And again, importing from TypeGraphQL. And it's going to be an int. And this string it can auto infer. So you'll notice I annotated these three columns with both a TypeGraphQL field and a database field. So this is basically, we're getting a 2-for-1 here. We're both getting a GraphQL type out of it and also a database type. So this is very handy and very nice integration. So over here now I can just say brackets here to signify its array. Just pass in a movie, and that's going to be our GraphQL type. And one last thing we need to make sure to specify is that this is a object type. And so that's how we specify in TypeGraphQL. We decorate the class, the object type. All right, so I can come back over here, create a new tab. You can say movies, fetch the ID, title, and minutes. And nice, now I can see my Bob movie here. So that went ahead and worked. And now I could insert more movies if I wanted to, and I could see them more here. One thing I want to note also is instead of doing the arguments like this, one practice that I tend to do, especially if you have a lot of arguments, is to create an input type. So the way we can do that is we can say class, and I'm going to call it a movie input, and we can say input type decorator to specify that it's an input. And we can create some fields here. So title, which is a string, and minutes, which is a number. And again, can't infer it, so we're going to specify that it's an int here. And so now instead of individually specifying the arguments, we have a single argument, which you could call options, for example, or input. And this is going to be of the type movie input. And so we can specify the type here, movie input. And then here I can just pass the options directly into the insert. All right. So now you'll notice we can just add fields to this movie input, and we don't have to do anything different here or add any more arguments. So what does this look like now? Well, when we create a movie, instead of specifying the types like this, we now say options, oops, and we specify a title, Bob2, minutes, this is a 60-minute film. So you now pass an object like this. So there's just a different way that you can specify this arguments. Now I also wanted to, when we create the movie, give them the option to also return a movie here. So I'm going to return a movie here instead of a Boolean. And so here, instead of inserting, one syntax that we can use is the create and then save. And this will actually return the movie for us. And then we can just return the movie from our resolver. Note, with TypeGraphQL, TypeORM, I believe this command does 2 SQL statements, one to create it and one to insert, one to select and get the movie after it's complete. So that's just something to note. I think if you do the insert command, you can then do returning and do 1 SQL statement, but this is just kind of a side note. All right, so our server restarted. Let's see this in action. So I'm going to create this movie, and now I want to be able to select the fields here, ID, title, minutes. And this is going to be a 2-minute film, and this is Bob 0.1. Alright, so I can see my create movie here now gets returned. And I can go back to my movies and fetch all my movies here. Awesome. Alright, so that's 2 of the CRUDs. We can create and we can read. I want to do 2 more. Let's do an update next. So mutation. And what do we want to return after a update? This is really up to you. I'm going to just say a Boolean true or false whether it worked. So I'm going to say update movie. And so here I want to take an ID. So I'm going to say arg ID. And so this is going to be a string. And then the second argument, so the ID is going to be the movie to update. Second arg, I'm going to say options. Or I can call this new movie value. I actually hate that name. I'm just going to call it input. And we're going to use our movie input here. And I'm going to say input is movie input. And so inside of here, I'm going to return true. Give this a save. And then we're going to say await movie. And again, movie is our entity here. So our entity from that, we can then call these commands. I'm going to say update the criteria. I want to search by the ID. And then the thing that we're actually going to update, the values that we're going to update, we pass as the second parameter, which is the input. I'm not sure what it's complaining about here. Oh, this should be a number, not a string. And so we need to specify that that's an int. All right, so we're going to give that a save. And now I can come over to my schema over here, say mutation. I'm going to say update movie. And let's update this one right here. So he has an ID of 3. Input, title, we're going to say Bob.23, and minutes is 65. So we'll run this, and it got true. I'm going to select our movies. We can see it updated the 2 values. Now, one thing you'll notice about this update movie right now is it actually requires me to do both fields. I can't just update the title, for example. And that's because we used our movie input here. And we strictly said you have to supply both these fields. So this is one kind of pain point, but you will have to create a separate movie input if you want this to work differently. So for example, I might call this the movie update input. And this is where the title can be a string or it can be null, for example. All right, so I'm going to say this is the type string and it's possibly null. And then this is going to be of type integer and it can be possibly null. And now I'm going to save or use this input type here in our update movie instead of our movie input. And you know what? I don't think it's going to like null here. I'm going to use undefined. All right, yeah, now it's happy with me. All right, so now back to our update movie here. Let's give this a try. So let's say I want to update this. I want to keep the minutes to 65, but now I just want to call this movie Tom. All right, so let's run this. Everything looks the same here. But if I run it here, we can see we get Tom, but the minutes is 65. So now we can just specify one field, right? Because we made each of these optional. All right, so that's updating. Now let's go over the last mutation, which is deleting. So we're going to say mutation, and we're going to return a Boolean from this. Now we don't really need to copy that. We're just going to say delete movie. And again, if you wanted to, you could return something differently here besides Boolean. I'm going to say arg ID. Again, we have to specify this as an int. And I'm going to say movie.delete. And if I hover over this, I can look at the type. And this is where I can see what we can actually pass in here. It looks like we just pass in a criteria. And I can just see we just pass in an ID here. And then that will actually delete the movie. And so here we create resolvers, and this is basically the flow. We create resolvers like this. We specify the return value of our resolver, any arguments it takes, and then we usually put our database logic here. So let's create a third one here. Mutation, DeleteMovie ID 3. We get true. And now we only have 2 movies here. So that did indeed delete the Tom movie. So there you go. This was a CRUD example using Type-GraphQL, TypeORM, and Apollo. So this hopefully gives you a good idea of how you can do kind of the starting operations, and you can expand it from here. And yeah, let me know in the comments below if you like this style of tutorial, and we can do an expanded version of this and add some more functionality.